the cost of working from 58 to 65 instead of retiring at 58 is approximately 7 of your remaining high-energy years, not 7 random years. The 7 during which you can hike a mountain at altitude without your knees filing a complaint, learn a new language with the brain plasticity to actually retain it, fly red-eyes without paying for them physically for 3 days, and pull all-nighters with grandchildren who won't be at home much longer than that. The Social Security Administration's 2022 period life table, used in the 2025 Trustees Report, puts a healthy 58-year-old at roughly 22 to 26 more total years of life expectancy. Roughly half of those years, by the time the actuarial math finishes being honest, will be years your body quietly informs you that you used to be younger. The other half are full-strength years. Working from 58 to 65 instead of retiring at 58, for most people with enough saved, takes 7 of your full-strength years and converts them into a marginal increase in portfolio size that statistically will not change anything material about your life. This is the math nobody runs for you. Today I'm going to. Most retirement content focuses on whether you can afford to retire at 58. That's the wrong question for an enormous percentage of the people watching. The actual question, the one with the higher financial stakes once you've crossed a certain savings threshold, is whether you can afford not to. Because every year past your number that you keep working is a year purchased with a currency more expensive than dollars. And the system you're working inside of, your employer, your financial planner, your friends, and your own brain, has no real structural incentive to point this out. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance for normal people. The kind that actually works instead of the kind that sells you a course. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you came for, hit subscribe. Today we will discuss the 3 curves that intersect at 58 in a way they don't at any other age. The specific reason 2026 made this conversation more urgent than 2025 did. And the exact math that explains why so many people with enough money to retire keep telling themselves 1 more year until 5. More years have quietly slipped past. Brian's problem isn't a math problem. Brian is 58. He's a civil engineer in Indianapolis. He's been at the same firm for 26 years, sits at a window desk now, and supervises a team of 7. His house is paid off. His kids are out of college and on their own. He has $1.4 million invested between his 401k and a taxable brokerage account, plus about $80,000 in cash. His wife Karen teaches part-time at a community college. They live on roughly $60,000 a year in actual spending. Every financial calculator he's run, including the conservative one his planner ran twice last year, says he can stop working today and not run out of money before he's 95. He hasn't stopped. Last week, he told me he might retire, next year probably. He said the same thing the year before, and the year before that. Brian is not the exception in the story, he's the rule. There's a documented academic phenomenon for people with the math to retire who refuse to do it. And it's been studied at multiple universities. The reason Brian gives himself for working 1 more year is always financial. The reason is almost never actually financial. And once you understand the 3 curves that intersect at 58, the entire framing shifts. At 58, 3 different curves are doing very different things in your life simultaneously, and they create a window that doesn't exist at any other age. Your wealth curve is accelerating, because if you've been saving for 30 years, your portfolio has crossed the point where compound growth produces more new money each year than you can add by working. Your health curve is starting to decline, slowly and invisibly, but the decline is real and the data on it is unforgiving. And the tax and healthcare window you have available between the year you stop working and the year Medicare begins at 65 is a specific 7-year structure that the IRS and the ACA marketplace have collectively engineered, whether they meant to or not, into the single most important planning window of your financial life. These 3 curves don't intersect like this at 50, and they don't intersect like this at 65. The specific geometry of 58 is what makes the math different. Each curve on its own is a half argument for not delaying. Together they form a complete one. Curve 1. Your wealth has crossed the point where you stop being the main engine. A portfolio of $1.4 million invested in a basic balanced index portfolio earns approximately 7% in real returns over long stretches. 7% of $1.4 million is $98,000 a year, or about $8,167 a month, in expected compound growth. The maximum amount Brian can contribute to his 401k in 2026, including the over 50 catch-up, is $32,500. His own maximum personal effort to grow his wealth, even maxed out, is roughly one-third of what his existing portfolio does for him on autopilot. The portfolio outperforms its owner by a factor of 3. This crossover has a specific name in the financial independence community. The point where compound returns exceed personal contributions is sometimes called the inflection point. Brian crossed his inflection point years ago. He's not building wealth through work anymore. He's adding marginal velocity to a vehicle that's already cruising. The compounding does roughly 75% of the lifting, and his W-2 contribution accounts for roughly 25% of the annual portfolio growth. He could stop contributing entirely and the portfolio would continue to compound at roughly the same rate, just with a slightly steeper drawdown if he was withdrawing instead of adding. Here's the math on what one more year of work actually does to Brian's portfolio. If Brian keeps working from 58 to 65, contributing the maximum $32,500 each year, his $1.4 million grows to approximately $2.53 million by age 65 at a 7% real return. If Brian stops at 58, contributes nothing more, and lets the portfolio sit untouched while he lives off some other source, it grows to roughly $2.25 million by age 65. 7 years of work, maxing his contributions, added about $280,000 to the final number. That's $40,000 a year of marginal contribution to his portfolio, generated by trading one of his last 15 high-energy years. The exchange rate is bad and it's getting worse. At 60, it gets worse than it is at 58. At 62, it gets worse than at 60. The compounding gets faster as the base grows, and the work contribution stays roughly constant. So each subsequent year of working past your inflection point adds proportionally less. I have a neighbor named Paul who retired at 54. He's 68 now. 14 years of his portfolio doing the lifting while he wasn't contributing a single dollar more to it. The account today is worth more than it was the day he walked away from his job, even after 14 years of withdrawals. He didn't time the market, didn't get clever with allocations, didn't have an inside line on what sector would beat the next. He let the math work for 14 years, and the math worked. Paul didn't have $1.4 million when he stopped. He had less than what Brian has now. What he had was the math figured out and the willingness to act on it. Most people who don't retire at 58 are missing the second one, not the first. Curve 2. The health-adjusted year is not the same as the calendar year. Here's the data nobody puts in a retirement brochure. According to the Social Security Administration's 2022 period life table, a 58-year-old American male has roughly 22.6 more years of expected life remaining, and a 58-year-old female has roughly 25.8 years. So the headline number is somewhere around 24 more years on average. But the headline number bundles together two very different categories of year, and the bundling is the problem. The concept that matters is something epidemiologists call healthy life expectancy, or HALE. It measures not just how many years you have left, but how many of them you can expect to live without significant disability or chronic illness limiting your daily activities. The most recent US data places HALE at about 66 years at birth against total life expectancy of about 77.5. The gap is roughly 11 years on average. Those 11 years aren't randomly distributed across your life. They're concentrated in the last decade or so. What this means for Brian, who's 58 today, is that of his approximately 24 remaining years of total life expectancy, roughly half are years he can expect to be functionally in his prime, and roughly half are years he can expect to be navigating one or more health conditions that materially affect what he can do. Call it 12 to 15 high-energy years. That's the budget. That's all of it. Everything else is bonus. If Brian keeps working until 65, he doesn't lose 7 random years. He loses 7 of his top 12 to 15. he's trading half of the highest quality remaining time he has on Earth for a 12% bump in his final portfolio size that, given his actual lifestyle, he was never going to spend. The decisions he could be making with those 7 years: learning to do something new, helping his daughter when her first child arrives, taking his wife somewhere they've never been, are decisions that have a finite remaining window. That window doesn't extend because you feel you deserve more time. It closes mechanically, and the actuarial tables don't negotiate with anyone. Most people don't run this math. The reason is that nobody around them wants them to. Brian's employer prefers him at his desk. His financial planner gets a percentage of an account that grows when Brian keeps adding to it. The social circle around him doesn't have a script for "I retired at 58 because I felt like it." The default everywhere around him points toward staying. The actual numbers point toward leaving. Curve 3. The 2026 healthcare window just changed underneath everybody. This section wouldn't have existed 12 months ago. Something specific happened on December 31st, 2025 that materially changed the math of retiring between 58 and 65, and almost nobody in mainstream financial media is talking about it correctly yet. From 2021 through 2021, the Enhanced Premium Tax Credit under the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act removed the upper income cliff for Affordable Care Act marketplace subsidies. A 60-year-old couple making $120,000 in retirement could still receive a meaningful subsidy on their health insurance. That subsidy structure expired at midnight on December 31st, 2025. On January 1st, 2026, the system reverted to the original ACA rules. The 400% of federal poverty level cliff returned. For a couple in 2026, that cliff sits at approximately $84,600 of modified adjusted gross income. $1 of income over that threshold, and the subsidy drops to zero instantly. The dollar amount of subsidy that disappears is significant. According to KFF's most recent analysis of marketplace plans, the average benchmark silver plan for a 40-year-old in 2026 is $625 a month, and for a 58-year-old it runs significantly higher. For an early retired couple in their late 50s, the difference between a subsidized plan and an unsubsidized plan in 2026 is often $15,000 to $25,000 a year. The cliff doesn't reduce the subsidy proportionally, it eliminates it. What this means for someone considering retiring at 58 is that the years between 58 and 65 are now the highest leverage tax management years of your entire financial life. Every dollar of taxable income matters because of the bracket math, the cliff math, and the long-term Roth conversion math all hitting simultaneously. People who retire at 58 and structure their income carefully, drawing from taxable accounts first, executing partial Roth conversions in low-income years, keeping their reportable income below the ACA cliff, can functionally get healthcare at deeply subsidized rates while still managing their tax-deferred balances down before required. Distributions begin at 73. People who keep working until 65, by contrast, never get this window. Their income is too high to qualify for any subsidies during the years they could have used them. And by the time they reach Medicare at 65, the most valuable optimization window of their financial life has closed without them having opened it. The 2026 ACA change made this window simultaneously more valuable because the cliff is back and more time sensitive, because there's a real chance Congress will adjust the subsidy structure again in a future year. None of this means you should retire at 58 specifically to maximize ACA subsidies. The relevant point is that retiring at 58 unlocks a specific 7-year planning window that doesn't exist at any other age. And that window was just made more valuable, not less, by the policy change at the end of last year. Back to Brian. I told you Brian's problem wasn't a math problem. Here's what it actually is. Brian's identity for 26 years has been the engineer who fixes things. His wife Karen recently described him to me as the guy people call when something complicated needs to work. He likes that role. He's good at it. The team respects him. The salary signals that the world values the work. None of these are bad things. The real reasons it feels difficult to walk away. But what Brian is actually optimizing for when he says one more year is not money. It's the avoidance of figuring out who he is without the title. His brain reads the proposition, Retire at 58 as lose the structure of meaning I've built around me for 26 years and replace it with what exactly? And his brain doesn't have a clean answer. So the brain does what brains do when faced with ambiguous future structure compared to concrete current structure. It picks the concrete one. One more year of work. The math is a justification, not a reason. The fix for Brian isn't more money in the portfolio. That part is already done. What he needs is the structure of what comes after, built before he stops working rather than during. He already has the financial structure. What's missing is the identity structure. What he gets up for, who he becomes when nobody is calling him with a problem, what he learns next, what he builds next, what he gives back, where his attention goes when his calendar has nothing on it. The people who retire well at 58 don't retire from. They retire towards something specific. And they've usually been quietly building that something during the last 2 or 3 years of their working life. The people I've watched do this well don't disappear into a hammock. They build something new with the available time. One former colleague walked out at 59, started a consultancy that occupies 2 days a week, and uses the rest of his hours to be home when his first grandchild arrives. Another took up restoring vintage motorcycles, which sounded like a quaint hobby until I found out he was selling the finished pieces for $40,000 each. A neighbor of mine went back to school for a classical literature degree he'd wanted since college, and reports being happier then. He's been in 20 years. They are not doing the same thing as each other. Each of them is doing something. What they share is that they prepared the structure of the next phase during the last 18 months of the current one, rather than jumping into a void and hoping the void filled itself in afterward. When Brian and I talked about this most recently, he said something I've heard a lot of variants of from people in his position. I think I'd be bored. Boredom at 58 with $1.4 million is not a financial problem. It's a curiosity problem, and curiosity is something you can practice. People who haven't practiced it in 26 years find it intimidating to start. That doesn't mean they can't. It means the first 6 months will feel uncomfortable and then it won't. What it actually costs to wait. Third, here's the closing math I want to leave you with, because it's the most useful frame for the decision. Every year past 58 that you work when the financial math says you don't have to, you are not paying with money. You are paying with 1 unit of your finite supply of high energy years, in exchange for a marginal portfolio increase that statistically you will not spend. The exchange rate gets worse every year because the portfolio grows faster from compounding, while the high energy year supply shrinks faster from age. The math doesn't reverse, it only accelerates. 65 has been the cultural default retirement age for almost a century, hardened in place by an institutional system that originally assumed most workers wouldn't live long enough to collect anyway. The number is older than televisions and operates today as invisible programming. There's no financial reason it should be the default for someone with $1.4 million invested in a paid-off house. There's a deep psychological reason, the same one Brian has, but the psychological reason isn't financial advice. It's a reason worth understanding, so you can decide whether it should still be making your decisions for you. The 3 curves at 58 are wealth velocity, health-adjusted years, and the 2026 healthcare window. Your wealth has crossed the point where the portfolio is the main engine, not you. Your supply of health-adjusted years is shorter than you instinctively think, and the best ones are now. And the 2026 ACA change opened a planning structure that didn't exist last year and may not exist again. All 3 point in the same direction at once. You may have noticed this is the part where the persuasive video usually tells you to do something specific. I'm not going to. Each person's number is different. What's the same across all of them is the underlying structure. If you're past the inflection point, if you have more saved than you can realistically spend, if your wealth is now your main engine, the cost of waiting is being paid in a currency you cannot replace. Run the actual math for your situation, then run the conversation about who you are without the title. Whichever one you've been avoiding is the more important one to run first. If you have any idea, and though, just leave comments below and I will reply as much as possible. If this helped clarify something, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.